and drugs. We've known forever that they're a terrible combination. Back in the 1980s, Nancy Reagan told our kids to just say no. She may have been on the right track, but the message was too simple and not deep enough to have any stickiness to it. She didn't tell our kids why they should just say no. I'm a developmental behavioral pediatrician and an addiction medicine specialist at Boston Children's Hospital. My work and the work of others is starting to unpack the relationship between kids and drugs. Actually, my office really is right down the block. I have a room on the first floor, but I don't have a window, so my work doesn't always see the daylight. So I'm really thankful to be able to come here to Fenway Park, stand under all this alcohol advertising, and tell you what I think every parent should know. The idea that adolescence is a distinct developmental stage is relatively modern. Until recently, by age 13 or 14, childhood was considered over. Now, I'm someone who's spent a lot of time with adolescents over the years, and I find it really hard to believe that middle-aged people used to consider 16-year-olds mature adults. It seems like we were really missing something. But human brain research has now demonstrated what most of us could probably intuit, and that is that the brain doesn't finish developing until around 25 years of age. And this developmental state of the brain during adolescence makes teenagers particularly vulnerable to developing addiction. So drugs stimulate the brain's reward center, and that's why drug use is pleasurable. You may have heard that marijuana use is safe because it's natural. But in actuality, there's nothing natural about artificially stimulating your brain's reward center. In effect, by binding directly to your brain, all drugs hijack the reward system, bypassing the natural feedback loops that nature has designed for us. And this hijacking, when it occurs repeatedly, can lead to neurologic changes that make the reward system not work properly anymore. That's how addiction develops. And it doesn't matter which drug is being used. The addiction develops the same way, whether it's nicotine, heroin, cocaine, or marijuana. And once addiction develops to one drug, it's very easy to develop addictions to other drugs. The younger you are, the first time you ever have a drink, smoke a cigarette, or use marijuana, the more likely it is you will ultimately develop addiction. So why are teens so vulnerable to addiction? The answer lies in brain development. As a developmental behavioral pediatrician, I'm particularly interested in how brain development correlates with behavior. The brain develops in a series of orderly steps. When an area of the brain starts to develop, the first thing that happens is a bunch of new cells develop, and each cell develops connections to its neighbors. If you looked at the brain under a microscope at this point, what you'd see is dense and bushy tissue. And when the brain reaches that state, the child is ready to learn a new skill. So for example, in the first couple of years of life, a part of the brain called the cerebellum, which plays a big role in the coordination of gross motor skills, undergoes pretty significant growth and development. And during that time period, babies get up and take their first steps. Now, anyone who's ever been with a child of that age knows that children of this age are driven to toddle. And toddling is really the right word for the unsteady, broad-based, slightly Frankensteinish gait of young walkers. But very quickly, that gait becomes refined. And if you took another look at the baby's brain, what you'd see is the extra cells are gone, the unused connections are pruned away, and the connections that remain that are producing mature walking have grown bigger and conduct signal faster. This orderly series of steps happens in different parts of the brain as children grow and mature. The reward center undergoes a big growth spurt during the school-aged years, and that seems to help children learn to distinguish between unimportant and important rewards. Young children aren't very good at that. That's why pediatricians' offices are always loaded with stickers, because for a 4-year-old, getting a sticker is as rewarding as getting a brand new toy. But learning to identify important rewards and work towards them is very important for the development of motivation and drive, which typically matures during the school-age years. The development of the reward center is also critical for its impact on adolescent behavior. So while toddlers are determined to toddle, adolescents often seek out extreme activities that result in large brain reward. They'll often do things that make adults think they're absolutely crazy. And this may be very important evolutionarily because the survival of the species had at some point depended on young people being willing to hunt big animals and to defend the tribe. In fact, even being willing to move out of your parents' house and go it on your own really takes a lot of guts. So a strategy of having adolescents that are willing to do crazy things and attuned to big brain rewards is actually evolutionarily kind of brilliant. But there's a flip side, and that is that the easiest way to get big brain reward is to use drugs. That's certainly not the type of pleasure that nature had intended for us, and yet drug use creates the kind of large neurologic payoffs that adolescents are seeking. At the other end of the behavioral part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. It's responsible for what we call executive functions, things like impulse control, error correction, and monitoring for danger. In short, all of the things that support good decision making. That's the last part of the brain to develop, so it's pretty unreliable during adolescence. That's why adolescents are relatively undeterred by risk, and they don't learn so quickly from their own mistakes. This part of the brain is also seems to be able to protect us from developing the neurological changes that result in addiction, and that protection is during adolescence. So it seems like adolescents are a setup for drug use and addiction. They're driven to seek large neurologic rewards. They are undeterred by risk and consequence. They don't learn very quickly from their own mistakes. And they're susceptible to developing neurologic changes in the reward center. It seems like adults should be doing everything we can to keep kids away from drugs. And in the US, we do have laws that make it illegal to sell alcohol or cigarettes to underage youth. But we fall pretty short. We allow the marketing of alcohol and other drugs as an essential ingredient to having a good time. We often label adolescent drug use as experimental, which sounds pretty harmless. We figure there's nothing we can do about it, and we turn a blind eye to it. None of that helps kids, nor does harsh punishment. But addiction is the one chronic disorder that is 100% preventable, that adults can do that's effective and might surprise you. Kids really do listen to us, so being sure that they have accurate information really helps. I have good news. In the past 40 years, according to national surveys, more and more high school students are making the decision not to use drugs. From a low of about 2% in the late 1970s to 25% in 2016. But the roar of industries that sell products like wine coolers, jewels, gummy bears, all of these things that attract a younger crowd are really threatening our progress and putting us at risk. So if you're a parent or somebody important in a teen's life, I urge you to talk to your kids and be sure that they understand they learn what they need to know and the context of it. Teens may be crazy, but they're not stupid. Making sure that they understand that drug use is unhealthy because drugs can damage a developing brain can really help protect them. You might be surprised just how effective this simple message can be. Thank you.